Hello! We are back with a new episode of Redressing Fashion. This is Laura, your host, and I'm actually in a different location today. This is my room slash home office. My desk is there, and I'm just trying out different locations, see which one I like better. So I hope you enjoy the tour of my different spaces. I actually kind of like this one, so you might see it again or not. We'll see. I am super excited about today's episode. It's actually a revamp of an older episode that I recorded actually about a year ago. I remember hopping on a call with today's guest, who is Faith Cooper. I can't remember if it was right before I left for a research trip that I did around Easter last year, so that's why I know it's been about a year, or if it was right after I came back. It's been a blur because right after that trip, I started teaching my first term at the Montfort University in Leicester, where I still work today, and this first year has just been super intense, super overwhelming, also very exciting and rewarding in many ways, but yeah, the year has flown by. I don't want to spend too much time talking about me today. I would like to introduce our guest, Faith Cooper, who is an amazing scholar and a beautiful person, I must say. After having a very long virtual friendship through social media, we finally met in person maybe a couple weeks ago, or like maybe a month ago. I'm not sure. But we had dinner, we talked about fashion, we talked about the podcast, we talked about diversifying fashion, about future plans. It was super exciting. I might have to bring her back for a follow-up interview. But today, I just want to share what we recorded last year. It was a very early morning for me, maybe like 6 in the morning, 6:30, something like that, because she was in Taiwan then, and so the scheduling was a little difficult. We'll hear her story from her throughout the podcast episode. I just want to introduce her and maybe fangirl a little bit about her before jumping into the interview. So, Faith, I met her again online probably around 2020, 2021, right after she started her Asian Fashion Archive, which is one of my favorite sources for diverse stories of fashion. And I just became obsessed with it. And the Asian Fashion Archive is one of my main models for public facing scholarship. And so I was thrilled when she accepted my invitation to the podcast. I find Faith's research to be not only super interesting, but also super relevant, especially in a world and in a fashion industry that tells us that it's all about the same kind of people, basically same kind of creators and the same brand names. And it's very refreshing to see different perspectives, hear different names, find about different stories. So that's what I like the most about Faith's research and Faith's project. So without taking up more time, let me read Faith's bio. And I feel like a little old grandma every time I put on my glasses to read stuff, but I'm kind of loving it. So I guess I'll just go with it. Okay, so Faith Cooper is the creator of the digital resource project Asian Fashion Archive. Currently, although that was already a year ago, so this is outdated. Forgive me about that. She is participating in the Fulbright U.S. student program studying brand and fashion management at Fujian Catholic University in Taiwan. Previously, she taught the cross-cultural expressions of fashion and dress course at the Fashion Institute of Technology and worked in the education department at the museum at FIT. In addition to her experience working in fashion education, Faith's past professional experience includes working at Christie's, Smithsonian Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Vogue, and International Condé Nast. Faith holds a master's degree in Fashion and Textile Studies and a bachelor's degree in Art History and Museum Professions, both from the Fashion Institute of Technology. I recently saw that Faith started working as the social media manager or communications manager. Apologize for not knowing the name and for not double checking before coming here. But she just started doing that with the International Journal of Fashion Studies, so that's super exciting. And I know that she is looking for opportunities to continue her research and graduate studies, but I'm not sure that I'm allowed to say a lot more than that. So we'll keep it there. Please do follow her. There are links for all of her platforms in the show notes. And I think we do mention some of them throughout our conversation as well. So follow her work, follow her trajectory. I'm sure that she will continue growing and doing very exciting things in and around fashion and contributing a lot to fashion studies. And with this, I'll just let our conversation take over. Thank you again for being here. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Have you ever imagined fashion being as diverse as human culture? Have you ever dreamed of a respectful, ethical, and socially just fashion industry? Have you ever envisioned sustainability being at the core of the entire fashion system? This is your host, Laura Beltrán-Rubio. I'm a fashion curator, researcher, and educator. My mission is to translate scholarly insights into actionable strategies that we can all take to reshape how we create, wear, and think about fashion. So find a comfortable seat, brew some tea, and open your notebook as you join me in the quest for redressing fashion. We are live. Hi, Faith. Thank you so much for being here, for accepting the invitation. It is an honor for me to count with you as the first guest also in this podcast. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm such a huge fan of your work. To be a part of it makes me so happy.
Thank you. I think it's two happy fashion historians here today.
Yeah.
So I want to start by asking you actually a little bit about how you got here and how you, I don't know if you consider yourself a fashion historian, but how you got into fashion history, especially because it's been kind of a long journey. I realized when reading your bio that you have been working in the arts and museum field and the fashion studies for about a decade now, and that's kind of a long time. Although I've also been in the field for about a decade and it doesn't feel that long, actually. But yeah, I just wanted to know what your journey has been, how you started getting interested in fashion, and especially Asian fashion and Asian fashion broadly conceived.
Yeah. So I've been interested in fashion really for as long as I can remember. And actually, my grandmother went to Central St. Martin's, which back then was St. Martin's. So I guess maybe it's in my genes. Yeah, so since I was a little girl, I've always wanted to, my dream was to go to New York and study fashion, which is what I did. I went to FIT and I got my bachelor's degree in art history museum professions. And I did a minor in Asian studies. So I guess that was when my first academic interest in Asia started. And then when I was a student, as an undergrad student, I did all these different internships that kind of led to really focusing on fashion academia. So I interned at my first internship was Vogue, which is where I helped with the Alexander McQueen Met Ball. So that was my first like real fashion museum experience, which is an amazing first one.
Amazing, yes.
Yeah. And then I did some experiences at Christie's, Smithsonian, Cooper-Hewitt, International Condé Nast, and then I served on a board at the Met during college. So I really tried to get as many experiences as I could to make sure, this is what I want to do and learn as much as I could. And then when I graduated, I got a job at the museum at FIT in the education department. So I actually worked there for 7 years. I took about maybe like a 2-year break after getting my undergraduate degree and just worked full time at the museum for about 2 years, which is when I applied to FIT again for my master's in fashion and textile studies, history, theory, and museum practice. So I stayed at the museum working full time and did my master's degree part time. So it took about 3-4 years. And while that program is mostly centered around Western fashion, which most fashion programs are, I was very fortunate. Yeah, I was very fortunate to have very supportive professors. I did 2 independent studies under Dr. Yunia Karamura about Chinese fashion and Chinese Orientalism in fashion. And even though she's a Japanese fashion specialist, she was able, to guide me in the right direction. And then I did my thesis on how Western culture and designers have glorified and glamorized China's Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. Like they just sort of took imageries to make it their own and ignored the realities of what was going on there. So now I am living in Taiwan. I'm doing a Fulbright here, and I'm getting my second master's degree at a school called Furen Catholic University, focusing on brand and fashion management, but focusing on the Asia Pacific region, which is so amazing. And I'm able to take history and culture classes related to Taiwan and China here, which I love. I'm trying to get better with my Chinese, but I'm slowly getting there. I studied it before coming to Taiwan, so I'm trying to get better. And my school actually also has a fashion collection here on Chinese and Taiwanese clothing. So I've been volunteering with them, which I love. So that has been really cool just to see. I'm so used to seeing Western clothing in a museum. So it's really cool to see Taiwanese and indigenous clothing and Chinese clothing here. And now I'm doing my thesis on how Taiwanese contemporary fashion designers express cultural identity through their clothes. Not everyone knows this, but Taiwanese cultural identity is very complex, especially now. It's not as direct as China, Korea, Japan. So it's really interesting to learn about how Taiwanese designers interpret their idea of Taiwanese cultural identity. So that's really how I ended up here.
That's amazing. And actually, it's also amazing that you managed to study under or like, have Yunya Kawamura as your supervisor. Because I think, as you mentioned, and I totally identify with this, it's very difficult to find professors that specialize in subjects that are non-Western.
Yeah.
And when I went to Parsons, actually, I think no one in my program, they had some idea about fashion outside the West, but they mostly specialized in Western fashion. And so I think I was lucky enough that they let me explore Latin America. They tried to help as much as they could, but it is difficult doing it by yourself, especially when you're only just starting out as an academic. So I think it's fantastic that you had that experience. And now that you're in Taiwan, kind of rounding up everything and seeing everything from the other point of view, I think that's amazing too. And also, I'm very much looking forward to knowing more about your research there, because I think, at least, and this is, of course, I think I am the average person when it comes to Asian fashion, because I feel like I know pretty much nothing about it. So this comes from ignorance, but I think that Taiwan hasn't really been studied as a subject. I think I have a general idea about Chinese fashions. I know something about Japanese fashion, especially when it comes to the Japanese fashion designers that kind of quote unquote conquered the West in like the 70s, which is a lot of Yunya Kawamura's work, but I don't think I can say I know anything about fashion in Taiwan.
Many people don't.
Yeah, so
even
this is a
I
great
didn't
contribution.
know
I'm
as
very
much.
excited.
Yeah, even me coming here, I didn't. I mean, I didn't know as close to as much as I know now. But it's probably similar. I know you've done similar projects where a lot of it does go back to like colonization and histories of different foreign influences and how it's established today, which is very complex. So studying that part and how it has been formed now is it's really interesting. And now, it's their situation now is complex today.
Yeah. Yes, and that's the thing with colonialism, right? It happened at a specific time period, but it leaves its mark, and it's a very long standing mark.
Yeah,
Because in Latin America, for example, technically most Latin American nations are independent since the early 1800s. So it's been 200 years. But you do
yeah,
see a lot of the patterns in the fashion industry and also outside the world of fashion, and the dynamics and the way that people relate to one another, and especially labor relations. They're pretty much the same, in essence
yeah,
at least. Maybe the details have changed, but and even who gets to be called designer, it's usually the, if not white people, the people with European heritage, European education, or like European style education, the people who are fully fluent in Spanish or Portuguese, which are the two main languages of the region. But then when it comes to racialized people, and especially to indigenous people, they are always referred to as artists, artisans, mostly
yeah,
artisans, I would say, even though many of them are designers. So even there, you see that the the traces of colonialism, or like the remains
yeah,
of colonialism taking place.
yeah. It's interesting the different words people use to describe different people, like ethnic. What is ethnic? What is fashion? What is traditional? It's so complex.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. I'm sorry, I'm totally going away from the questions I had sent
Oh,
you before, but
it's okay.
I'm curious if you found any of this happening in Taiwan. Like, are there different words that are being used, or how?
So one thing that I found really interesting was, so basically how I did my thesis is I attended a bunch of fashion shows and industry events. I read everything I possibly could on the history and development of Taiwan's fashion industry and development of the clothing, of how it's changed. Taiwan went through different periods, like the Dutch colonized them, then it was Qing Dynasty, then Japan, and now it's called the Republic of China. That's the official name. But a lot of people don't know Taiwan has indigenous groups. So of course it's different because most people speak Mandarin Chinese here. So the choice of words is different in that sense, but now I'm seeing more people use indigenous over Aboriginal, and from my research, I've seen so much support for the indigenous groups. I've seen a lot of Taiwanese designers, even if they do not identify as being one of the indigenous groups, they will partner with indigenous groups who are artisans who practice like specific traditional weaving methods or dyeing methods to continue that tradition. So that's one of the things I found that I wish the United States did more, is supporting and really trying to preserve indigenous traditions and craft. I have not seen much of that in America like I do here.
Yeah. Although I do think that in the States there is a quite large and growing group of very visible indigenous designers and indigenous fashion scholars, and platforms that maybe grew as little platforms created by them and probably for indigenous people too. But I think they are growing and they are slightly entering the mainstream. So hopefully that'll lead to more collaborations if they make sense. But I think in general that's taking us to at least seeing indigenous fashion more,
Yeah,
yeah, more frequently in the
yeah,
States, I would say. Of course, other people who probably know more than me about the subject might have different opinions, but
yeah.
I have seen a sort of resurgence of indigenous fashion design in the States, which I, to be honest, kind of admire, because I wish this was the case in Latin America, because I think many indigenous designers are used by bigger brands to sell, to show that they are different, to
Oh,
show how they are exotic, to show how they have built these specific kind of ethnic identity. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily benefiting all of the indigenous peoples or even the indigenous designers as much. Whereas in North America, I think these growing group of indigenous designers are really doing the work to reshape things, to change the fashion world a little bit more, and to push us outside of, the white Western narratives of fashion. And I think that's very, very important. I think one of the things that we still have to do is try to understand how to make it all work together, so that, indigenous fashion design becomes a thing, but also within the hegemonic groups, and so that it's valued outside of indigenous communities, which I think is usually what happens. I think indigenous communities and some people that like know about them understand it and value it, but then the general public doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I would love to see more educational
Mm.
programming or exhibitions or academic
Yeah.
institutions highlight Indigenous work in fashion and dress. So hopefully in the future.
Yes, hopefully, and hopefully it becomes global. And so I think we're seeing some connections here, which I love, and I didn't necessarily expect it. But it's kind of extremes of the world, to very different places, and we're seeing still some similarities at least, which I find fascinating. But now, going back to our original order of ideas, I wanted to ask you about the Asian Fashion Archive, which I think is one of your biggest contributions to fashion studies as a field. And this aligns, I think, with your overall research and a lot of your research projects that you have been working on for a long time. And when I was thinking about interviewing, I kind of went back to the Asian Fashion Archive. I think I mostly use Instagram and look at what you post on Instagram. I don't think I had ever read the about page so carefully. And one of the things that I loved about it is that you describe it as more than just a digital humanities project, because it has become a sort of community for people who share a passion for Asian culture and fashion. And so I wanted to ask you about, well, first of all, how you got into creating the Asian Fashion Archive, which I did read a little bit about in the about page, but then also how this community has formed, how it has influenced your work, but then also even your mission as a scholar, or what you want to do, what you want to achieve as a scholar, because I think it's very different when you are a researcher just working on your research silently and, maybe publishing academic papers. And it's a completely different thing when you actually take this to the internet and social media and share your knowledge with people, and especially when people start, like communicating back with you, and when it becomes such a strong community, I think that kind of changes the dynamic. So I'm also curious about that.
Yeah, so I started this project, which you probably read in 2020. I had just graduated from my first master's program at FIT, and this was during COVID quarantine. So I was in my studio apartment for like 2 years alone under quarantine, and this was also a time where we start seeing a rise in Asian hate. I can only talk about what, the United States. I know it wasn't just the United States because that's where I was living, and for me, it was, there were instances that happened to me, people I know. And then, of course, you're reading it on the internet, you're seeing it on the news. It was really,
Yeah.
really scary. It really was like, it felt like I just jumped into a different world. So for me, it was very hard. So to worry about my mom and myself and all of these things while worried about COVID, it was really difficult. So for me, I needed to find a way to process those feelings. And of course, I've always loved fashion and art, culture and history. So this project kind of gave me a reason, to wake up in the morning. It gave me a chance to investigate other Asian cultures that I'm not so familiar with from different regions. And it was just my outlet of using my academic qualifications to express beauty in these groups and identities that are being attacked. So really, I didn't really have, I'd never expected it to get the support as how much it's gotten today. I just wanted to explore different ways to express Asian people and Asian identities in a very broad, beautiful light. I think a lot of the comments and incidents were out of, well, racism and ignorance. And to me, it was really hard to fathom just attacking a whole diverse group, and this was from people I knew and strangers. So that's how the project came out of a time of hate and really selfishly a form of mental therapy for myself. But essentially the project, it aims to highlight fashion, history, and culture related to Asia. And of course, Asia is very broad. That is a big point I try to make through the images is, you know, you can't put all Asian people and all of Asia in one box. It's so broad. And the histories are very complex and the cultures are because there's so many. Through the Instagram, I highlight different themes. So I typically use 6 images. That's how I organize my grid. And I do a specific theme. So the last one was Chinese New Year in Singapore during the 50s and 60s. I've done the Japanese artist Kusama. I've done like famous Asian designers or street photography. I try to make it diverse in terms of communities, time periods, and different people. And then I also will try to reshare relevant content from other accounts on my story. So that's really just using imagery. Some people, learn that way. I like to learn that way through images, so it's accessible that way. So about a year after I created the Instagram, I created a website. I got a lot of feedback from people saying they want to learn more, they don't know where to start. These are mostly non-academics, who want to learn more. So I created a website that offers a variety of resources for people to learn more. And it's videos, articles, museum exhibitions, lesson plans. So I really tried to make it for people who wanted a very deep academic dive, or just a magazine article or a funny YouTube video, entertaining YouTube video or documentary, or a teacher or lesson plan. That was my main goal, to make it as accessible as possible for a wide amount of groups of different levels of knowledge. But my main motivations for the project, like I said before, is to show how diverse Asia is. You really can't aesthetically group them into one group. I also believe many people can be intimidated by fashion and other cultures that are not their own. So I hope that through these resources that it would broaden their minds about what fashion is. It's not just, Chanel and Dior. It's more than just that. For me, it's how I see how can people express themselves. And the third motivation was really to spread content that is more diverse. I personally am tired of seeing the same images spread on Instagram related to fashion history. That's very Eurocentric. I like to learn about communities that are not my own and I'm not familiar with, especially through images. So this was my way of trying to diversify people's Instagram feeds through these images.
Yeah, and I think it has been very successful, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a beautiful project. And to everyone listening, we will leave relevant links for this conversation in the show notes. But yeah, now that you talk about images, I think I, of course, work with images too, although unfortunately, because I study the 18th century, which is kind of old, images are not my main resource. Sometimes written archival documentation is actually better for me because it contains more information than the few images that I have access to. But I think images are super important because, first of all, fashion is all about images. And even if it's us, regular people wearing clothes on our everyday life, I think it's a lot about the image that you project. And we do have these very specific images, which are usually very Western and like recent, of what fashion is and what fashion should look like. And so seeing different images and like alternative images of what fashion can be and what fashion can look like is actually very important because it helps us expand just how fashion is conceived, very broadly speaking. And this also takes me to another question that I wanted to ask you, and is what's Asian fashion to you? And I think you explained it already a little bit. What's Asian fashion in the Asian Fashion Archive? And I think it's a lot about fashion in its broadest diversity within the land that we now call Asia. But and I'm really asking because I think there's a similar thing in Latin America. It's a very large, probably smaller than Asia, but it's a very large region, has many different countries, as in modern nations, but all of these countries are the result of older structures that were also super diverse and had many different types of people and, cultural histories, social histories. So it's a very, very diverse region. And I do talk about Latin American fashion when I refer to the region, but I also do realize that there's probably not one single common aesthetic to Latin American fashion, so it's kind of difficult to define it as a whole. So I'm wondering how it works for you, if you think there are maybe some common threads or some common like aesthetic or design practice aspects in that are shared by these different cultures and countries, or if not necessarily, and it's just your way of locating your work kind of geographically.
Of course, some Asian countries share similarities. For example, my family's from Singapore, which is in Southeast Asia, but it's multicultural. But my family is ethnically Chinese. So when I went to Chinese New Year in Singapore and Southeast Asia, you see a lot of Chinese imagery and traditions, despite it being far from East Asia. And then, of course, Japan and China has some similar cultural traditions. So it really depends on country and region and pathways of immigration. But I do generally I think it's just so incredibly broad and diverse. But of course there's, similarities between different countries. So one thing I do hope to debunk with this project is that there is fashion in Asia. It's not just Europe, New York and Milan and Paris. There's different ways to express culture, even with now it's in my mind because I'm writing my thesis now. Even within each indigenous groups in Taiwan, each one has their own cultural expression. So it's so hard to say, like with my paper now, you can't really define even just Taiwanese fashion. You just can't. So to define Asia, it really depends on immigration patterns, and of course there's colonial elements and wars between each country and who married who, establishing new cultural identities. Yeah, so it's very hard.
Yeah. Well, this leads me to a maybe even harder question. How do you define fashion? Like, what is, because we've been speaking about fashion all this time, and I think we kind of understand what it means to us. And for example, when I think about fashion, I certainly include a lot of, I include Asian expressions of fashion, and I think I conceive it in a very, very broad way, which is not necessarily how everyone does. And I do get a lot of pushback for using the word fashion when I refer to indigenous fashion, when I refer to fashion in the 18th century, when I refer to especially historical Latin American fashion. I don't know if that happens to you, but yeah, but I'm also wondering, what is your definition of fashion, especially around your work? How do you frame what counts as fashion and what doesn't count as fashion within your research and your work?
Yes, I think there was a reason why I chose fashion as part of my Asian Fashion Archive name, because I did want to emphasize there's fashion outside of all the Eurocentric systems I'm used to studying and what people think of as fashion. And also it's not just Eurocentric clothing. I don't think of fashion as only like very expensive designer clothing. I think that needs to be debunked. For me, I think, like you said, fashion is very broad. That What I love about fashion is I see it as a way as people expressing themselves or demonstrating a message, rather through hair, makeup, clothing, accessories, appearance, trying to spread some type of message, if it's just your individuality or if it's political or cultural. It's such an important, powerful tool that we've seen throughout history and is still seen today, of how people showcase their identity in a public way. I mean, for me, it's such a beautiful statement. Even if you look at through history, that was really the only way how a lot of women could express themselves, was through their clothes. And so now to see, again, sorry, back to my research, to see how some designers express these very complex themes, and I think it's just very beautiful and powerful. And it's a way more people can understand these themes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think by including all of these sort of alternative narratives, alternative histories, new names, new practices within fashion, you are already expanding that very Eurocentric canon that we've been fed. And I think an important thing is to recognize that, I mean, fashion, of course, can be about the Western European designers that we all know about, but that's not all of fashion. There's so much more to it. So it's important to recognize that too. Like, there are many expressions of fashion.
Yeah. And of course, I'm not saying all European designers or fashion is bad. Like, I love going to Europe. I love going to Versailles and shopping. For me, I just think it's so ingrained in us that fashion only exists in those places. Even some academics think that, or people who are not used to talking about fashion. That, I think, point needs to be made more. And I think we're seeing more of that in academic institutions and academics, which is really great.
Yeah, I think that too. I think the general field is willing to open up more and to understand how fashion takes place in different contexts, and also studying fashion outside of Europe alongside the development of fashion in Europe. So yeah, I think it is an exciting moment because the field is definitely expanding, and it's expanding to hopefully become more diverse and share the work and histories of many more people, or yeah, of more people.
Yeah.
So back to Asian fashion and your work more specifically. And I don't know if maybe you're ready to share something from your thesis specifically, but I wanted to ask you if you have any favorite insights from Asian fashion history, or like any maybe favorite people or creatives or groups, moments in time, styles, I don't know. If you could pick, and I know this is very difficult because it's like choosing a favorite child, which it's pretty much impossible to do, but if do you have like two, maybe three examples that you can share with us about Asian fashion?
Yeah, sure. So I think my favorite garment is probably the Chinese qipao or cheongsam, which I wrote an article for Fashionary's database on it.
Yes.
My family have historically worn it. My mom wore one as part of her wedding, and there's a lot of research published on it. There's been so many exhibitions, even throughout time, even from its origins to now, it's been very controversial. And many people, I don't think, know that it also tells important stories of not just Chinese history and culture, but diaspora groups as well. So it has changed when people in Hong Kong started to wear it, in Singapore, Taiwan. And that, I think, is really beautiful, that it's evidence of how diaspora groups have changed and formed new identities. And of course, for myself, it reminds me of my mom wearing one, or my grandma or great grandmother, and I think how it started, which you can read more on the Fashion Erase database, but it was like it was a very powerful message that many women wanted to express. It started in the 1920s. This was towards the end. Well, the Qing dynasty did end, so Chinese women are getting more freedom back. And it was a really powerful expression. And now I think it's talked a lot about in terms of cultural appropriation, but don't worry, I
Yeah.
won't get into because that's a whole different topic. But I really like learning about it and reading what people think. So that's my number one. My second one is I really love the Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore. The fashion curator there, Jackie Young, is an amazing curator. She's so passionate about spreading Asian fashion designers and very thoughtful in her process. And I went to an exhibition there a few years ago about a Chinese fashion designer, Guo Pei. And I went with my mom, who grew up in Singapore. And my mom did not study fashion academically, or anything like that. But for her to see a Chinese designer highlighted in an exhibition for fashion was so touching to her. And I think it really, to me, it was a huge, awful message about how important, you know, how other people, it's just so nice for other people to see themselves reflected in cultural institutions. It was really a touching and special experience. Oh, and they do wonderful publications on fashion in Asia, exhibitions. So I'm looking forward to the next one. And third, I think I don't want to say my favorite, but one of my favorite scholars is probably Dr. Yunia Karamura. Not only has she been a huge mentor to me, I think she's one of the first ones to really write about Asia and fashion, Japanese fashion and Japanese subcultures. And she recently wrote an amazing book on cultural appropriation. She has taught me so much about different words related to fashion and being very thoughtful about it. And actually, one of my last jobs before coming to Taiwan, I taught her non-Western cultural expressions of fashion and dress course, which I love how she laid it out. You know, she really didn't want to jam all of non-Western cultures in one course, which is really impossible. She was very conscious about just looking at specific case studies, and inviting speakers in who specialize in different communities. So yeah, I would have to say those are my three favorite that I can think of.
I love them. Also, the chupao, I think, is one of those garments that is very significant because it is recognized in the West. I think it is a symbol of Chinese fashion identity and maybe even Chinese identity. Like, I think we can remove the fashion there around the world. So to Chinese people, but then also to non-Chinese people. I think it's definitely a very, very symbolic garment. Yes,
Yeah.
you're writing about it in the Fashion and Race database. I super recommend it. I have read it more than once, for sure. And also, I think it's curious that you mentioned the Museum of Asian Civilizations because I have also added several of their exhibitions to the Fashion and Race database. Like we have this library section where we just highlight a lot of different resources, and I'm sure I've added more than one of their past exhibitions. I don't know if I have added any of the catalogs. Maybe, I'm not sure. I should go back and check and maybe add some more if I haven't already, or if someone else in the team hasn't already. But from afar, that's one of the museums that I'm like, I really wish I could visit.
Yeah, you
Hopefully
should make
one
a trip
day.
there. Yeah.
Yes, hopefully one day I'll make my way to Singapore and see it in person. Okay, so I think we're almost at the end. And this question that I have next, I think you've been maybe hinting towards the answers for it throughout our conversation. I think when you talk about non-Western fashion, it's kind of impossible not to talk about redressing fashion, which to me, I think put shortly means to maybe correct the limiting and limited definitions and in narratives and histories and ideas that we've been talked about fashion. So basically expanding the fashion canon in a way. But then also, I think, and I've started to think more maybe politically about this too, as in, or understanding redressing as a way also to offer reparations in a way, or like compensate for everything that has been going wrong with fashion in a way, especially how these non-Western groups and expressions of fashion have maybe been diminished or excluded, if not violently attacked in different at different points in time. So my question is, from your perspective and from your quite thorough knowledge of Asian fashion, how do you think we can redress fashion?
Well, it's so hard because I never like to, and I don't think can be a spokesperson for all of Asia.
Yeah.
Or I'm an expert of Asia, not even close. You know, most of the things I try to reshare what other people did, which can be one of the answers for this question. I think institutions need to do a better job of broadening their educational curriculum. Like you said, when you were at Parsons, there was not many non-Western fashion courses. I did not have any, really. And now I am seeing more classes being offered, which is great. I think we need to teach students about other cultures as well as the importance of learning other other cultures and the importance of representation. And I think there's so many people who are doing a good job of offering different resources like Fashion Race Database and the work that you do. And I do think there needs to be more diverse exhibitions and programming in cultural institutions and not just viewed as a checklist, you know, like, okay, we've done this, check, we can revisit this in 10 to 20 years. I think we also need to see a variety of communities highlighted. I don't think only Asians should be highlighted. That is just my academic and personal interest. I love learning about other groups that I'm not familiar with. So I think it needs to be more broad and create thought provoking projects. Culture is so complex and very complicated histories are tied to creating new identity. So I don't think projects should be rushed or trivialized. I think some people shouldn't try to rush to write about a culture they're not familiar with, you know, which goes to my third point. I think people need to listen more to a wide range of academics and professionals. There's many voices, multiple different diverse voices, and create open, safe spaces to have these type of conversations. And I think, and you can disagree with me if you think I'm wrong. I don't think anyone's asking everyone to be an expert on every culture, but people have their very specific niches in research in terms of academia. So, you know, just listen and be open and offer safe spaces, form collaboration. You know, I don't think you need to try to do everything on your own.
Yes.
But those would be, my ideas.
Yeah. And I actually think there's something to be said about getting specific, right? Because you've been saying this repeatedly throughout this conversation. Asia is very broad. Asia is very complex. And Asia is very diverse. And I think we tend to group certain regions, and there is a reason for the grouping. We tend to group certain regions into one single thing, but that doesn't like it's that's not the case. So the fact that we talk about, and we have been talking about Asian fashion, for example, today, or that I talk about Latin American fashion, I think makes sense because it allows us to like group a geographic region that through history has kind of become like a cohesive thing. But that doesn't mean that everything that happens within that region is the same, or that fashion within that region is homogeneous. So I think it is important to also maybe lean into those niches and those expertises that you were talking about to recognize the actual diversity, which again, I know it's not something that we have necessarily been doing here today because we're talking about Asian fashion super broadly. But once we talk about Asian fashion or whatever other, grouped fashion broadly, then we can start getting into the little details and the different expressions. And I think that's also important. to do. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, definitely. Like now that I'm focusing on cultural identity for this paper, my consensus for this paper is using Taiwan, for example, you can't just define Taiwanese fashion like that. There's so many different elements, and I think that's with many different cultural groups, and also it goes back to the individual, what they think.
Mm-hmm.
So I do wish people would realize how complex cultural identity is and listen to different voices when discussing about it, and then you have to consider the histories that are tied to it and the current issues.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so one last big question, and I think this is my educator coming out in this podcast. I like to end every podcast episode with 3 little things that I'd like listeners to take away. So this time I'm asking that question to you. What do you think are the 3 main things that people that are listening to us right now should maybe know about Asian fashion and culture, or that you'd like them to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think, and these are things I've repeated throughout the conversation, but definitely Asia is so diverse. There's so many histories, cultures, languages, looks, beautiful history, as well as very tragic events that are tied into establishing identity. And I think a great resource that discusses this is the book Fashion, Identity, and Power in Modern Asia, where they go through different case studies about this topic. Second, the culture is very complex. Learning about it is very complex. I don't think it should be taken so lightly. One resource that does a really great job about this topic is Rethinking Fashion Globalization. I think the way they talk about this idea, I think maybe this was one of your books, potentially for your book club, right? I remember, I think I voted for it. Yeah, I think
Yes.
the essays really talk about it. It's really opened up my eyes, and it's not easy concepts to understand, but they're very important. And third is that fashion is very global. It's not just in these major cities, and it's not just in Asia. You can really see it everywhere. And I wish and I hope people would be more willing to open their minds and learn about other communities. And it's okay if you don't know everything. I definitely do not know everything on every community, and I love learning about it, especially through your work, which you make it very accessible and easy to learn. So I'm so
Thank
thankful and
you.
inspired, by the work that you do. So I wish people can broaden their minds when think about fashion and culture too, and not just stick to the same themes.
Yes, well, the
Yeah.
inspiration is mutual because I love your work too, and I am
Thank you.
constantly looking at all the beautiful images that you share.
Thank you.
Well, where can we learn more about your work? Where can we find you? Are there any articles that you recommend?
Let me think. Well, I have a professional website where I link articles and speaking engagements that I've done, which is faithtcooper.com. So that's basically my website resume. And then, of course, if you want to learn more about any resources, you can check out the AsianFashionArchive.com, or you can follow my LinkedIn account where I try to regularly post upcoming projects that I do there.
Yes, and follow the Asian Fashion Archive on
Yes.
Instagram, of course. Yes, one of my favorite resources, which I have also. Speaking of things I have shared the Asian Fashion Archive in my newsletter, which now has like a whole kind of blog section in my website, so it's there.
Yeah, I'm so
But yes,
thankful. Thank you
everyone
so
should follow
much.
it. Thank you, Faith. Thank you for this conversation, for sharing your knowledge, for your time. I am a firm believer that we should try to do something for the people that do something for us. You have certainly done a lot for me throughout my academic research career. You have inspired with the Asian Fashion Archive, especially. You have inspired me to want to share more about my own research and to want to diversify fashion. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you to the podcast. So thank you so much.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you so much.
And well, I don't know if you can think of anything that either me or our listeners can do as a way of thanking you for sharing all your knowledge. Please do, well, either let me know privately or let us know. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's been such a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too.
Thank you for tuning in. You know that I love a good conversation about fashion, so please don't hesitate to email me or message me on social media to continue discussing any of the ideas introduced in this episode. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast, leave a review, or share it with your favorite fashion friends. It does make a huge difference as we try collectively to build more spaces for thoughtful and nuanced conversations that can truly help us redress fashion.